Right, let's hope I remember to turn my mic on this time, because last time I didn't, and I did this for over 25 minutes. It was perfect. I didn't stammer or stutter, got it all done, and then thought, yeah, that's pretty good. And I'd forgotten to turn the mic on. I'd forgot to plug it in. Okay, so page 221, we're going to have a look at a quick review of language for comparison and contrast and how to define various topics. So, now the book has done it in a slightly weird way by trying to talk about the vocab first. So what I'm going to skip that, and we're going to go straight into what comparison and contrast actually means and how to do it, and why we do it. Because otherwise I think it's kind of flogging a dead horse. Also, it's, well, to use the horse analogy and stretch it further out, it's putting the horse before the carriage. It doesn't make any sense because that's how horses go. They're always in front of the carriage. So we're going to skip the first part and go straight to understanding language, comparison and contrast. So in simple terms, comparison and contrast helps us to define how things are the same or different. So it's comparing one thing to another. Now in comparison, what we're doing is we're saying how something is like something else. So what we're doing is we're taking two things and we're showing how they are similar but not quite the same. In contrast, we're showing how they are different. So we're using the same two things to show how things work. And the reason we do that is because people mostly think visually. And there's lots of phrases that we use to define this in the English language, such as they're as different as chalk and cheese, or it's like comparing apples and oranges. And as soon as I say those things, you're picturing chalk and cheese or apples and oranges. Your brain is conjuring up an image of those things because that's how our brains work. Most of us visually. So we do a comparison or contrast so that we take something unusual and we show it next to something that's much more usual. So if I was to describe my brother to you, I'd say, well, first of all, I need to paint an image in your head. First of all, I need to show you so that you're imagining something which has got a baseline. Now, a baseline is something that we build from. The baseline is where we begin. So what I'm going to do is to say, my brother is the same size, shape, and build as me. So now, straight away, you're picturing a person standing next to me who is exactly the same. So my brother is the same height, the same build, the same shape. He was working in London as a security agent, and he had a custom suit, a handmade suit, and it fitted me because our skeletons are almost at exactly the same size. So we start off by saying he's very much alike me. Now, immediately you're picturing my brother as being like me. Then I start to go into how we're different. So he has quite light brown, almost blonde hair. So straight away, now we're looking at him with hair. He doesn't wear glasses, so again, there's another contrast. Doesn't wear glasses. He's got fat recently, where I look after myself, another difference there. So we begin by painting a picture of how things are the same, then we start to veer towards how they are different. And that's how we describe something normally, because that's how humans work. We like to have something to connect with. We need to drop an anchor. An anchor puts us in place. An anchor, like in a ship, we drop an anchor so that the ship doesn't move. Now, when we're painting a picture of something, that's what we do. We anchor ourselves to a reality. So when we're talking about Yetis, as an example, we're always comparing them to the size of a human being. Now, a human being is something we can all relate to. So they're always our baseline for comparison when we're talking about something like this. We always try and compare it to something human because we don't really understand how anything else thinks. We can't imagine ourselves as an animal. You may think you can, but you can't. A cat, for instance, is not just a little human. It's not just a human reduced in size with a bad attitude. It's not. It's a cat. It thinks of the world in a totally different way. It doesn't have a sense of consciousness, a sense of time, a sense of ideals or morality. It lacks those things. It's a cat. It's very, very different. But it helps us to think of it as version of ourselves. We like it when they pretend to be little people, even though we know that they're not. So we always begin with a comparison and then we switch to a contrast. And like with the Yetis, we start by saying, it's like a human, only taller. It's a hominid, like we are, arms, legs, walks upright, but it's taller, has bigger feet, smells bad, covered in fur. like an Iranian, I guess. And then we would start to look at how these things are different. And we do this comparing it to great apes, maybe bears, other people. Examples of comparing it to the size of a 15-year-old boy or a fully grown adult. And again, that doesn't make much sense because a 15-year-old boy in Cambodia, for instance, is going to be, well, anything from sort of here, I guess, up to here, and sometimes larger. In England, it would be maybe at the lower mark to the higher mark. And then in Poland, a 15-year-old could be bigger than me. So not really much point in doing that, except it gives us an idea. It gives us a rough edge that we can talk about. Then we can start going into the differences. And that's how it works. So let's have a look through, and I'll expand on those points. So, comparison and contrast. Comparison and contrast involves looking at two things to see how they're alike and how they're different. And normally, we'd be taking one thing that's familiar and we'd be showing how it's less familiar. To gather the information for comparison and contrast, the topic should be broken down into parts and analysed. We can then examine these parts for similarities and differences. Okay. Sometimes a similarity can be unusual. If I was to meet a stranger and he had the exact same prescription, sunglasses as me, that would be unusual. So it'd be worth noticing that the similarity is unusual. But normally we're looking at something similar because the similarity would be normal. The language used to compare parts of the topic include connectors such as well as if, like, similarly, and the same way. I think you all know that. So here's an example. It's a hairy creature, rather ape-like, with hair ranging from grey to reddish brown. It sounds very much like my brother. The first type, called a Thelma, is said to be small, about the size of a 15-year-old boy. The second type, the Mite, excuse my pronunciation, is supposedly the size of an average adult human. So probably a bit smaller than me if we're talking about global averages. So in the first example above, two creatures are compared, the Yeti and an ape. So the hairy creature, rather ape-like. So straight away you're picturing the idea of an ape. The Yeti and an ape, the Yeti and the ape with respect to their build or shape. So what are the topics under comparison in the second example? Well, first of all, we're taking the Thelma. Now, to a degree, we're comparing it to the Mite. We're saying that the Thelma is small, the Mite is much larger. Also comparing it to humans, because again, humans are our baseline. We're going to compare everything eventually back to a person or something that's very, very familiar. So that's what it's discussing in the second example. The language used to contrast parts of the topic includes connectors like however, on the other hand, nevertheless, but, yet, although, even though, and in spite of. Normally, because when we're doing a contrast, these things are less expected. So we're taking somebody into the similar and then we're shifting to what is less expected or unexpected and saying, but it's also different. And that's what it's like. If you wanted to talk about your latest car compared to your old car, we would talk about how these things vary. The old car was red, the new one is blue. Even if it was the same make and model, we talk about the differences because they're what sticks in your head. And that's just, again, how human beings think. But we would normally start with the comparison and move on to the contrast. Think of it like this. If you did buy a new car and somebody was talking about it, they wouldn't say, his new car is nothing like a motorbike. Of course it's nothing like a motorbike, it's a car. We'd never talk about the contrast first. We would always talk about the comparison first. His new car is just like his old car, only it's a different colour. See how it works. Not his new car is nothing like a motorbike, but it is like his old car. That you never hear somebody speaking like that because it's not how our brains work. Language is a very interesting thing. Language represents things like maths. The numbers you write on the board are not maths. The maths is the abstract concept. The writing on the board is trying to give that a form. And that's what language is. Language is trying to give form to an abstract concept. And those concepts change the way you think to a degree. But they're also built around the way we think. So we would always start with the comparison and move on to the contrast, because that's how our brains work. But also you can restructure the language to actually change the way people think. And a good writer would know how to do that. They would lead you into a false sense of security and then break it for you, but they would do it to entertain you. And that's what a good writer does. They take you into a description and then suddenly shift it around. That's how we end up with twisting the tail stories, which I think are the best, most interesting stories, where we finally end with something unexpected. And we can only do that if we hide certain things from you or lead you into making a conclusion that isn't correct. As long as we do it in a good way, it's fun and interesting to read. But knowing the rules allows you to break them. And the rules are that we start with the comparison, then move on to the contrast. So let's have a look at the next example. Hilary was allowed to see the scalp, which he described as looking like a pointed cap of reddish hair. But he said there was no way to know exactly what it was. Hilary managed to persuade them to send it to him and then sent it to laboratories in Chicago and Paris for analysis. The scientists, however, were not able to come to a definite conclusion. Hardly surprising, to be fair. If I was to get that Yeti scalp today and take it to a good lab somewhere in America, they wouldn't be able to come up with an answer, because DNA isn't preserved very well in hair. Hair is already dead when it comes out of your body. The best sources of DNA are in active tissue, bone marrow, or your stomach, something like that. They would be the best examples of DNA. Maybe blood, but you're not going to get good DNA from hair or a tooth. If I was to knock out a tooth and leave it on the floor for a few days, it wouldn't be a great source of DNA. At least not after this length of time and being preserved as it has. So it's going to be very difficult to get DNA evidence from hair and scalp that's in a cold country like this, in an unpredictable environment. You know, the inside of the room is heated, the outside is sub-zero at certain times of the year. So it's going to be very, very difficult to get an answer to what this thing really was, especially from scientists who by definition should be skeptical. They don't want to believe, they need to prove it. And they don't want to be seen to be believing. They don't want to buy into propaganda of any kind. They want to have the answers. So straight a scientist, by definition, is also a skeptic. Okay? So it's going to be very difficult to get a straight answer from a scientist. That's why we always hear from doctors or biologists, inconclusive. It means that they don't know. Okay? And we hear that even today. In fact, science has probably taken several steps backwards in modern times. That's a whole different story. So I'm not surprised that they couldn't get an actual answer from them back then, because science has moved on, but we really wouldn't be able to get much more of a better answer even today. To move on, the connector but in the above example is used to put the physical description of the scalp in contrast with what the object actually was. Yeah, we start with the description. He's allowed to see the scalp. Is described as looking like a pointed cap of reddish hair. So it looks like this, so you've got that image in your head, but there was no telling exactly what it was. Poorly worded, I would say there's no telling exactly where it came from. Not what it was. We know what it was. It's a piece of skin with hair sticking out of it. The connector, however, is also used above. It's highlighted. In the case, what idea was put in contrast with the information that scientists were unable to come to a definite conclusion? So it went for analysis, however, because when you send something for analysis, you expect there to be a result. However, there wasn't. So it makes sense, and it's unfortunate with stories like this about the Yeti, where there is no physical evidence. There is a plethora, a huge amount of circumstantial evidence and eyewitness accounts. There are footprints, there are all sorts of other things that sort of strongly suggest that this thing's real, or it could exist, or it does exist, but we don't have any overwhelming evidence. We just don't have the proof. And that's very sad, because I would love this thing to be true. I really would. I'd love to catch a Bigfoot. I'd love to have an example of this so that we can analyze it and find out what's the truth. Because there are some fascinating things here. There really are. The pointed head reminds me of stories of... in the documentary, it talked about the sons of gods pairing with the daughters of man. Now, this is an old story from the Bible, but it goes down into a lot of other myths, a lot of other mythological tales about the demigods gods having children that walked the earth and then made babies with the daughters of man. And if you go to the ancient texts about the origins of humanity, it does tie in that these sons of gods had conical heads. It's a fascinating story, and it all ties together in a very interesting way, but there just isn't the proof for it, and that's very sad. It's like it just goes almost there and fails. It just stumbles at the last step, and that's a real shame. But this is how we use comparison and contrast. We normally talk about something that we know or something that you know, and then we take that image and we start to bend it so that we've got a more accurate image. And this is how we talk. When we're describing a sound or something we've seen that's unusual, you would never describe it accurately. We don't do that. I don't do that. If you were to hear a sound outside and someone said, "What did it sound like?" and you'd say, "It was a rhythmic pulsing sound with a high frequency hum," people don't talk like that. They'd say, "Well, it sounded like a helicopter, only it was more shrill." That's what people do. They compare first, then they contrast. And that's normal in the way that we speak. As a writer, I need to know that kind of stuff because I need my characters to sound convincing. I need them to sound realistic. And I have to know how people talk. Now, you hear it every day, but you're not aware of it until someone like me makes you aware of it. So have a look at the way people talk. Next time you're in a conversation with somebody, ask them something, get them to talk in terms of comparison and contrast, and you'll see that we all do it the same way. Now, I don't speak Khmer, and I haven't had a conversation with someone who speaks Khmer describing something, but I bet it's the same, because that's how our brains work. I bet it's the same for everybody around the world. That's how we describe things. We give you an image and then we show you how what we're talking about isn't quite like that image. It's just human nature. So, a little exercise for you. What I want you to do is practice by looking at units section 7.3 or 7.5. I want you to do those exercises as a bit of practice. Be good, but I want you to do them. Then I want you to go to Google Class, and I've left you a little project. Now, what I've done, I don't have a pen, so you'll have to use your imagination. I've given you two lists, list A and list B. Now, list A is 26 items long, 1 to 26, and I've given you 26 different stupid things. And B, I've given you another 26 stupid things. Now, you'll notice that 26 is the amount of letters in the alphabet, A through to Z. Now, in the first list, I want you to use your personal name. Like mine is Jack, I'm Jack. So I would go down to J, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. There it is. And I would look at that thing. Then I would have my family name, and I would go to list 2, and I would find the thing that relates to that. That would be an A. Then I would compare the two. So answer the question on Google Class by looking up the two lists and giving me a comparison and contrast for the two objects I've got you to compare. Now, it's a silly exercise because I've tried to make it a little bit stupid, so that it's a little bit of fun. So do the practice exercises, contrast and comparison exercise, talk about how these two things are similar, and talk about how they're very different. You might find it's a bit more challenging than you think. You might get lucky, it might be really easy, but compare and contrast different things to show how that works. Okay, thanks very much. Bell's going. Thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.